At 1600 hours on June 6, 1944, First Lieutenant John Dolan crouched behind a stone wall 80 yards from Fière Bridge, watching 3 captured French tanks roll toward his position with German infantry following close behind. Behind him, 4 paratroopers with bazookas waited in foxholes. Ahead, 500 yards of causeway stretched across flooded marshland to the village of Cauquigny, where German forces held the western bank. Dolan commanded Company A of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He had landed in Normandy 16 hours earlier, with orders to seize and hold this bridge at all costs. Now, 27 years old from Washington, he was about to make the most important tactical decision of his life. His men were outnumbered 4-1. They had minimal ammunition. 2 more German divisions were converging on their position. Battalion headquarters told him to hold the bridge for 24 hours. But here's what the Germans didn't understand. By concentrating forces to retake this bridge, they were committing tanks and infantry to a narrow causeway where American bazookas could destroy them one at a time. The Germans thought recapturing Fière would open their route to Utah Beach. Actually, every tank they sent down that causeway would burn. Every infantry assault would break against prepared defenses. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. And the 2 days they spent attacking this bridge would cost them any chance of stopping the Allied breakthrough from the beaches. Dolan knew this because 3 hours earlier, at 1300 hours, Brigadier General James Gavin had explained to him exactly why holding Fière would destroy German counterattack capability in this sector. And what happened in the next 48 hours would prove Gavin right, would destroy the German 91st Air Landing Division's offensive capability, and would turn what looked like an impossible defensive position into one of the most decisive small unit actions of the Normandy invasion. The first American paratrooper killed in the Fière sector was Private Robert Neeland, who died at 0200 hours on June 6th, when his parachute landed him in the flooded Murderette marshes. The weight of his equipment dragged him under before he could release his harness. He drowned in 4 feet of water, while German machine gunners fired at other paratroopers landing around him. Neeland was part of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. They had jumped at 0130 hours, 5 hours before the first landing craft would hit Utah Beach. Their mission was to seize 2 bridges over the Murderette River, Fière and Chef du Pont, and hold them until forces from Utah Beach could link up. Without these bridges, troops and tanks coming off Utah Beach would be trapped in a narrow coastal corridor with no way to advance inland toward Cherbourg. The 505th had combat experience. They had jumped into Sicily in July 1943. They had jumped into Italy in September 1943. They knew how to operate behind enemy lines, how to fight scattered and reorganize, how to accomplish their mission with whatever forces they could gather. But the Normandy drop was different. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had ordered the Murderette River Valley flooded by damming locks downstream. The result was thousands of acres of marshland disguised by tall grass that aerial reconnaissance had missed. When paratroopers landed in those marshes, weighted down with 75 pounds of equipment, many drowned. Others struggled for hours to reach dry ground, losing weapons and ammunition in the water. Private Robert Murphy landed safely on Drop Zone O at 0140 hours. He was a runner with Company A. 19 years old, from New Jersey, he had forged his father's signature to enlist at 17 because he wanted to be a paratrooper. He landed 20 yards from a road, assembled his rifle, and within 30 minutes had linked up with Lieutenant Dolan and Sergeant William Owens. Murphy watched as Company A assembled with remarkable speed. 98% of the company gathered within 1 hour. That was exceptional for a night combat jump. Most units were scattered for miles, spending hours searching for their men. Company A had trained extensively in night operations, and their officers and NCOs had drilled assembly procedures until every man could execute them in darkness. By 0300 hours, Dolan had approximately 150 men ready to move. That included stragglers from other units, men from the 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry regiments who had missed their drop zones and attached themselves to the nearest organised force. Dolan didn't care what regiment they came from. He needed every man for what came next. The approach to La Fière began at 03:30 hours. Dolan moved, and his company south along a dirt road bordered by massive hedgerows, the ancient Norman field boundaries made of earth packed with centuries of root growth, higher than a man's head, thick enough to stop rifle fire. The hedgerows provided concealment but also restricted movement and limited visibility. Every intersection was a potential ambush point. They reached the La Fière manor at 05:30 hours, just before dawn. The manor was a stone farmhouse with outbuildings and barns, sitting on a small rise overlooking the bridge. German soldiers occupied the building. Dolan positioned his 1st and 3rd platoons around the manor and waited for enough light to see what they were attacking. At 0600 hours, with first light breaking, Dolan and Lieutenant John Wisner from the 507th stormed the bridge. German machine gun fire from the manor and from positions across the causeway drove them back. They tried again. Same result. The Germans held the manor in strength, had clear fields of fire, and weren't giving up easily. By 0700 hours, more American forces were arriving. Brigadier General James Gavin, Assistant Division Commander, had been moving through the marshes trying to reach his units. He arrived at La Fière with about 45 men from the 507th. Colonel Roy Lindquist from the 508th appeared with elements of Company B. By mid-morning, approximately 550 paratroopers from multiple units were gathered near the bridge. Gavin was 47 years old, from Brooklyn, the youngest general officer in the army. He had commanded the 505th in Sicily and Italy before becoming assistant division commander. He understood airborne operations better than anyone in theatre. He looked at the bridge, looked at the causeway stretching 500 yards across flooded ground to Cauquigny, and immediately understood the tactical situation. Gavin explained it to Dolan, while they sheltered behind a stone wall watching German positions. The Murderette River wasn't really a river anymore. German engineers had flooded the entire valley by closing locks to the south. The result was a shallow marsh, maybe 3 to 4 feet deep in most places, extending more than 1,000 yards wide. You couldn't cross it except on the causeway, a raised dirt road barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. That causeway was the key terrain. Whoever controlled it, controlled movement between the American drop zones and the western part of the Cotentin Peninsula. The Germans had 2 divisions west of the Murderette, the 91st Air Landing Division and elements of the 6th Parachute Regiment. If those divisions wanted to counterattack Utah Beach, they had to cross at La Fière or Chef du Pont. If the Americans held the bridges, those German divisions were trapped west of the marshes, unable to interfere with the landings. More importantly, Gavin said, defending the bridge meant channeling any German attack into a narrow corridor where American firepower could destroy them. The Germans couldn't flank the position because the marshes prevented movement. They couldn't bypass the bridge because they needed the causeway for their vehicles and heavy weapons. Every German attack would come straight down that causeway into prepared American defences. Dolan understood immediately. Getting trapped defending this bridge wasn't disaster. It was exactly where American light infantry could defeat German armour and infantry. The narrow frontage meant numbers didn't matter. The flooded marshes restricted German manoeuvre, and American bazookas could destroy tanks on a causeway where the tanks couldn't manoeuvre or use their speed advantage. At noon, Lindquist organised a coordinated assault on the manor. Company A from the 505th, Company G from the 507th, and Company B from the 508th would attack simultaneously from 3 directions. Artillery support was unavailable. They had no mortars. It would be small arms fire and grenades. The assault went in at 12:15 hours. German soldiers in the manor fought from the ground floor and cellar. The Americans fought building to building, grenade to grenade, room to room. One American fired his bazooka directly into a ground-floor window. The building started burning. German soldiers tried to escape through the back. Rifle fire cut them down. By 12:30 hours, the manor was in American hands. Approximately 12 German soldiers were dead. The rest had fled across the bridge toward Cauquigny. Now Dolan could see the full tactical picture. The bridge itself was a small stone structure, maybe 20 feet long, crossing the actual river channel. Beyond it, the causeway stretched 500 yards to Cauquigny, raised about 3 feet above the marsh on both sides. The road was dirt, maybe 12 feet wide, just enough for one vehicle with tight clearance. Captain Schwarzwalder from the 507th took approximately 80 men across the bridge and down the causeway toward Cauquigny. The plan was to establish a bridgehead on the western side, secure Cauquigny village, and link up with other paratroops who had landed west of the Murderette. Schwarzwalder's men made it across the causeway and entered Cauquigny by 1300 hours. Then German counterattacks began. Elements of the 91st Air Landing Division's 1057th Grenadier Regiment hit Cauquigny from 3 sides. Schwarzwalder's 80 men were outnumbered 5-1, taking casualties, running low on ammunition. They fought for 2 hours but couldn't hold. By 1500 hours, they were retreating back across the causeway, carrying their wounded, pursued by German infantry. The Germans pushed them all the way to the eastern end of the causeway. Some Americans got trapped in the marshes, trying to wade through water that looked shallow but had mud underneath that sucked men down. The Germans held Cauquigny and the western end of the causeway. The Americans held the manor and the eastern bridgehead. A stalemate developed. Dolan organized the defense. Company A would hold the manor and the immediate area around the bridge. He positioned his command post in the manor itself, with observation of the entire causeway. He placed his 2 best rifle squads in positions, flanking the road where they could fire down the length of the causeway. And most critically, he positioned 4 men with 2 bazookas right at the bridge. Private First Class Leonard Peterson would be the primary gunner on the south side of the road. His assistant gunner was Private Marcus Heim. Peterson was a Swedish immigrant who barely spoke English. Heim was 19 years old, from Minnesota. On the north side of the road, Private First Class John Balderson would be the gunner with Private Gordon Prine as his assistant. Prine had been rifleman until that morning when the original bazooka man broke his ankle on the jump. Prine had never fired a bazooka in combat. Dolan explained the mission. When German tanks come, and they will come, you let them get close. You wait until they're committed to crossing the bridge. Then you stand up, expose yourselves, and destroy them. You'll be under machine gun fire from infantry behind the tanks. You'll be under fire from tank cannons. But if you don't destroy those tanks at the bridge, they'll break through to the manor and kill everyone. The bazooka teams understood. They dug fighting positions behind a concrete telephone pole on the south side and behind a stone wall section on the north side. They prepared extra rockets, positioning them where they could reload quickly. Then they waited. Major Frederick Kellum, the battalion commander, arrived around 1400 hours. Kellum was 42 years old, a professional officer who had commanded the 1st Battalion since Sicily. He surveyed the defences, talked with Dolan, and positioned a 57mm anti-tank gun on the high ground behind the manor. The gun had arrived by glider that morning. Its crew had dragged it up the hill and positioned it where it could fire down the causeway with clear fields of fire. At 1500 hours, German artillery began hitting the American positions. Not sustained bombardment, but intermittent fire, ranging rounds trying to locate American positions. The shells fell around the manor, cratered the road, exploded in the marshes. Several men were wounded. The medics had almost no supplies. They were treating men with bandages torn from parachute silk. At 1600 hours, the sound every man had been dreading echoed across the marsh. Tank tracks, engines, the distinctive squealing grind of armoured vehicles moving slowly on a dirt road. Through the haze and smoke, Dolan could see them coming around a curve in the causeway. 3 tanks. They looked odd, not German designs. They were captured French Renault R-35 tanks, obsolete by 1944 standards, but still armed with 37mm guns and machine guns. Behind them, German infantry advanced in column. The tanks weren't just moving toward the bridge. They were pushing American prisoners ahead of them, 12 to 15 paratroopers captured during Schwarzwalder's retreat, being forced to walk in front of the tanks as human shields. The prisoners were picking up anti-tank mines that the Americans had laid on the causeway and throwing them into the marsh. The Germans were using captured Americans to clear their path. No one in Dolan's company could fire. Shooting would kill their own men. The tanks advanced slowly, deliberately, the prisoners visible ahead of them, the infantry following behind in tactical formation. It was a perfect exploitation of American reluctance to harm their own troops. The lead tank reached a point about 50 yards from the bridge. Dolan made the decision. He couldn't let the tanks reach the manor. He ordered his bazooka teams to engage. The tanks were close enough now that even if the prisoners were hit by crossfire, at least the tanks would be stopped. Peterson and Heim stood up from their position behind the telephone pole. They were completely exposed. German machine gun fire immediately concentrated on their position. The bullets hit the pole, chipped the concrete, buzzed past their heads. Peterson aimed, fired. The rocket struck the lead tank's front armor and penetrated. The tank stopped. Smoke poured from the hatches. The second tank fired its cannon at Peterson and Heim. The round flew high, struck the telephone pole above them, shattered the concrete. Fragments rained down, but somehow neither man was hit. Peterson calmly reloaded, aimed at the second tank, fired again. Another hit. The second tank's track separated. The tank slewed sideways, blocking the causeway. On the north side, Balderson and Prine were engaging the third tank. Their first rocket missed, flew over the turret. Prine loaded another. Balderson fired. Hit. The third tank stopped, tried to back up, but its engine was damaged. The German tank commander opened his hatch, tried to climb out. A dozen American rifles opened fire simultaneously. He fell back into the tank. The German infantry behind the tanks were now trapped on the causeway with nowhere to go. The tanks blocked their advance. The marshes on either side prevented flanking. American rifles and machine guns fired down the length of the causeway into the infantry column. The survivors tried to find cover behind the tanks, behind bodies, in shallow depressions in the road. For 15 minutes, it was slaughter. The Germans couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, couldn't effectively return fire. They were pinned on an elevated causeway in the open, with no cover taking fire from multiple directions. Finally, a German officer waved a white flag. He requested a ceasefire to collect the wounded. Dolan agreed. The Germans carried their casualties back toward Cauquigny. The Americans counted bodies. Approximately 80 German soldiers killed on the causeway. 3 tanks destroyed. American casualties from that engagement: 4 wounded, none killed. The bazooka teams had stopped a German armoured assault with 0 American deaths. But while the ceasefire was ongoing, Major Kellum and Captain Dale Roysden, the battalion operations officer, decided to resupply the bazooka teams. They were carrying satchels of rockets forward when German mortars began falling again. Maybe the Germans saw them moving. Maybe it was pre-planned fire. Either way, a mortar round landed directly on Kellum and Roysden. Kellum died instantly. Roysden was mortally wounded, died an hour later. Dolan became acting battalion commander. He was a first lieutenant commanding a battalion in combat 6 hours into his first day in Normandy. Around him, the defence was holding but barely. Company A had started with approximately 150 men. They were now down to perhaps 100 effectives. Ammunition was running low. The 57mm anti-tank gun had been knocked out by German tank fire. The medics were overwhelmed. German artillery continued throughout the evening. Not heavy, sustained bombardment, but harassing fire, a few rounds every 30 minutes, enough to prevent rest, enough to cause casualties. Several men died from artillery wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical treatment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battalion aid station had no morphine, no plasma, minimal bandages. Night fell. June 6th became June 7th. The Germans didn't attack during darkness. Both sides used the night to reorganize, resupply as best they could, prepare for the next day. Dolan positioned his remaining men in fighting positions around the manor and bridge. He kept the bazooka teams at the bridge with orders to stay alert. If German tanks came at night, they'd be even more vulnerable on the causeway. At 0800 hours on June 7th, German artillery opened up again. This bombardment was sustained, intense, the heaviest fire the Americans had experienced. Shells fell on the manor, on the bridge, on the causeway, on every identified American position. The bombardment lasted 2 hours. Men, huddled in foxholes, pressed themselves against stone walls, took whatever cover they could find. At 1000 hours, the German infantry assault began. No tanks this time, just infantry, but hundreds of them, advancing in waves down the causeway from Cauquigny. The Americans waited until the Germans were 200 yards from the bridge, then opened fire with everything available. Machine guns, rifles, the few remaining grenades. The lead German wave broke after advancing 100 yards. Too many casualties, too little cover, the fire too concentrated. They pulled back. 10 minutes later, they came again, this time with smoke grenades for concealment. They advanced another 50 yards before American fire stopped them again. The Germans kept attacking. Third wave, fourth wave. Each time they advanced a bit further before breaking. They were trying to overwhelm the defense through attrition, accepting casualties to gradually close the distance. And it was working. Dolan's men were running out of ammunition. Each attack left them with less capability to stop the next one. At 1100 hours, Sergeant William Owens, commanding what remained of Dolan's 3rd platoon at the bridge, sent Private Murphy back to the command post with a message. The platoon was down to 15 men. They were almost out of ammunition. They couldn't stop another determined assault. Could they pull back to better positions? Dolan understood what Owens was saying. The defense was collapsing. One more German attack might break through to the manor, but pulling back from the bridge meant giving. The Germans the causeway. Once they held the causeway, they could bring tanks and artillery forward, establish positions on the eastern bank, threaten Sainte-Mère-Église itself. Dolan took out a small piece of notepaper and wrote, "I know of no better spot to die. We stay." He handed it to Murphy and told him to take it back to Owens. Murphy low-crawled back to the bridge, dodging German fire, delivered the message. Owens read it, looked at his remaining men, and said simply, "We stay." The Germans came again at 11:30 hours. This was their strongest assault yet, perhaps 300 infantry advancing in coordinated fire and movement, some troops shooting while others moved, proper assault tactics. They reached within 50 yards of the bridge. American fire had diminished, rifles were almost empty, machine guns were jamming from continuous firing without proper cleaning. Then, suddenly, inexplicably, the German assault stopped. The attacking infantry pulled back. Officers were shouting orders, troops retreating in disorder. Across the causeway, German vehicles were turning around, heading back toward Cauquigny. The attack was over. Dolan didn't understand what happened until later. The Germans had received reports of American reinforcements approaching from the east. Lieutenant Colonel Maloney was bringing approximately 100 men from Chef Dupont. The Germans, already taking heavy casualties in the frontal assault, decided they couldn't afford to be caught between two American forces. But the reality was that if the Germans had pushed one more time, they probably would have broken through. Dolan's defense was at its breaking point. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The men were physically and mentally spent. One more assault might have succeeded. Instead, the Germans pulled back, and the Americans held. By evening of June 7th, the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment arrived to relieve Company A. Dolan counted his remaining men. Of the approximately 150 men who had fought at La Fière on June 6th and 7th, 17 were dead, 51 wounded, and 81 still able to fight. The casualty rate was over 40% in 48 hours. But they had held the bridge, 3 German tanks destroyed, estimated 400 German infantry killed or wounded. The German 91st Air Landing Division's attempt to retake La Fière and push toward Utah Beach had failed completely. For the Germans, La Fière represented a tactical disaster that cascaded into operational failure. General Wilhelm Falley, commanding the 91st Air Landing Division, had been killed early on June 6th when his staff car drove into an American patrol. His replacement, Colonel Eugen Koenig, was trying to organize division operations from incomplete information. Koenig knew American paratroopers held La Fière and Chef du Pont. His orders were to clear both bridges and open the road network to allow German reinforcements to reach Utah Beach. He committed the 1057th Grenadier Regiment to retake La Fière. He expected success. The Americans were lightly armed paratroopers, scattered from their drop, probably low on ammunition and supplies. A determined assault with armor support should sweep them aside. Instead, his regiment was shattered. The tank battalion lost 3 tanks immediately, destroyed by paratroopers with bazookas in a perfectly executed ambush. The infantry assaults achieved nothing except casualties. Every attack down the causeway was stopped by concentrated fire from prepared positions. The Americans wouldn't break. Koenig couldn't understand it. German doctrine said surrounded paratroopers should surrender or withdraw. These Americans were doing neither. They were holding a bridge that should have been indefensible, inflicting casualties far beyond what their numbers should allow, and showing no indication they planned to give up. By June 8th, Koenig reported to higher headquarters that retaking La Fière would require at least another regiment, probably 2, plus artillery support he didn't have. The division couldn't afford those losses. The Americans from Utah Beach were advancing inland. German forces were being pushed back on multiple fronts. He needed to consolidate his remaining forces, not waste them in repeated assaults against prepared defences. The tactical decision was made to contain the La Fière position rather than assault it directly. German forces would hold Cauquigny, prevent American expansion west of the Murderette, but not waste combat power trying to retake the bridge. That decision guaranteed the Americans controlled the eastern end of the causeway and could use it whenever they chose to push west. From the German perspective, the larger operational picture was even worse. The 82nd Airborne had been assigned 3 primary missions: capture Sainte-Mère-Église, secure the Murderette crossings at La Fière and Chef du Pont, and destroy bridges over the Duvet River to prevent German reinforcements from the south. By June 8th, the 82nd had accomplished all 3 missions. Sainte-Mère-Église was firmly in American hands. La Fière and Chef du Pont bridges were denied to German forces, and scattered paratroops had blown or captured enough Duve bridges that German units south of the river couldn't reach the invasion beaches in strength. The result was that 2 German divisions, the 91st Air Landing and significant portions of the 6th Parachute Regiment, were trapped west of the Murderette with no way to influence the battle for Utah Beach. Approximately 15,000 German troops were rendered combat ineffective not because they were destroyed, but because they were in the wrong place, cut off from the action by a handful of American paratroopers holding bridges over flooded marshland. German after-action reports documented the frustration. The 1057th Grenadier Regiment reported that attacking La Fière was suicide. The narrow causeway prevented tactical maneuver. American defensive positions were perfectly sited to create interlocking fields of fire. Every assault was observed from the moment it began, targeted by pre-registered fires, and stopped before it could develop momentum. The reports noted that the American paratroopers fought with a determination that exceeded anything German troops had encountered previously in the war. They wouldn't retreat even when surrounded and outnumbered. They wouldn't surrender even when running out of ammunition, and their small unit leaders made tactical decisions with a speed and aggression that prevented German forces from exploiting local advantages. On June 9th, the Americans launched their own assault across the Fière causeway. General Gavin had been reinforced by elements of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment. He had tanks from Utah Beach. He had artillery support, and he had 3 days to plan the attack. The assault began at 10:45 hours. The 325th Glider Infantry advanced across the causeway in 2 columns, one on each side of the road, with Sherman tanks providing fire support. German defensive fire from Cauquigny was intense. Men fell by the dozens. The causeway was too narrow to maneuver, too exposed to avoid fire. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carroll led the assault. He made it halfway across before a German machine gun burst killed him. Company E's commander, Captain Charles Murphy, was hit in the face but kept moving forward. Lieutenant Richard Johnson was wounded in the ankle and arm but continued advancing. The advance became a matter of pure will, men forcing themselves forward despite casualties, despite fear, because that was the mission. By noon, American troops had secured Cauquigny. The road west was open. Their Corps could now advance off Utah Beach toward Cherbourg with a secure western flank. The cost was severe. The 325th Glider Infantry lost approximately 300 casualties crossing that causeway. The total American casualties for the 4-day Battle of La Fière exceeded 250 killed and more than 500 wounded or missing, but the Germans lost more. The 91st Air Landing Division reported 2,200 casualties in the first 6 days of fighting around the Murderette. The division was effectively destroyed as a combat unit. By August 10, 1944, the 91st Air Landing Division ceased to exist, absorbed into other units because it had been so thoroughly mauled in Normandy. For the paratroopers who held the bridge, the battle became legendary within the 82nd Airborne Division. Military historian S.L.A. Marshall would later call it probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms. That assessment was based on the casualty rate, relative to forces engaged and the intensity of combat sustained over multiple days. Marcus Heim, Leonard Peterson, John Bolderson, and Gordon Prine, the 4 men who destroyed the German tanks on June 6th, each received the Distinguished Service Cross. General Omar Bradley personally presented the medals. Their actions on that bridge, standing in the open under concentrated fire to destroy attacking tanks, became a case study in courage and tactical execution. Sergeant William Owens, who held the forward position at the bridge through 2 days of German assaults, was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross by Lieutenant Dolan. The award was never approved. Dolan would later write that, "This is a story in itself," but never explained what happened. Owens was later awarded a Silver Star during Operation Market Garden in Holland for similar actions. First Lieutenant John Red Dog Dolan, who commanded Company A throughout the battle and wrote the message, "I know of no better spot to die," continued to serve in the 82nd Airborne through Holland and the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, he became a lawyer in Boston. He never spoke publicly about La Fière until 1959, when, at the urging of Robert Murphy, he wrote a detailed letter to General Gavin describing the battle. That letter became one of the primary historical sources for reconstructing what happened. Private Robert Murphy, who carried messages between Dolan and Owens during the worst of the fighting, survived the war. He finished high school, became a trial lawyer, joined the Army Reserve, and retired as a colonel. He served 2 terms as national president of the 82nd Airborne Association and returned to Normandy many times for commemorative parachute jumps. He spent his life ensuring that the story of La Fière was told and remembered. Brigadier General James Gavin, who understood immediately why holding the bridge mattered, went on to command the 82nd Airborne Division in Holland and Germany. He became one of the Army's youngest two-star generals. After the war, he served as ambassador to France. He never forgot La Fière. In his memoirs, he described watching Peterson and Heim stand exposed on the bridge firing at German tanks as one of the most remarkable displays of courage he witnessed in the entire war. The tactical lessons from La Fière influenced American defensive doctrine for decades. The principle that defending critical terrain forces enemy forces into kill zones where firepower defeats numbers became fundamental to Cold War defensive planning. The coordination of small unit actions, the importance of junior leader initiative, and the effectiveness of anti-tank weapons in prepared defenses all became case studies at every military school. The bridge itself became a memorial. Today, a statue called Iron Mike stands overlooking the causeway, a bronze paratrooper keeping eternal watch over the marsh where so many Americans fought and died. The statue is identical to the one at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, home of the 82nd Airborne Division. French citizens erected plaques naming the streets for American soldiers who fought there. One road on the western side of the Murderette River bears Marcus Heim's name. Every June 6th, ceremonies are held at the bridge. Veterans, families, historians, French civilians all gather to remember what happened and why it mattered. The Leroux family, whose farm at La Fière became a battlefield, returned after the fighting to find their home in ruins and most of their livestock dead. But they understood. American paratroopers had fought to liberate their country, had died in their fields and on their property. The Leroux family preserved the memory of that sacrifice, told their children and grandchildren, ensured that the story would not be forgotten. The Battle of La Fière demonstrates military success through understanding terrain and enemy and capabilities better than your opponent. Dolan and Gavin understood that the causeway created a choke point where American bazookas could defeat German tanks. The Germans understood only that they needed to retake the bridge, not why attacking it was suicidal. The battle demonstrates the value of junior leader initiative. Dolan was a first lieutenant commanding a battalion because his superiors were dead or wounded. He made life and death decisions without higher approval because communication was impossible and time was critical. His decisions were correct because he understood the tactical situation and had been trained to think independently. The battle demonstrates that sometimes the most important thing troops can do is simply refuse to quit. Dolan's message to Owens, "I know of no better spot to die. We stay," captured the essential requirement of that defense. The position was nearly impossible to hold. The odds were terrible. Success was unlikely. And yet, if they didn't hold, the entire Utah Beach operation was threatened. So they held. They fired until their ammunition ran out, then scrounged more from casualties. They fought until they were wounded, then kept fighting. They held that bridge because holding it was the mission, and the mission was more important than individual survival. That mindset, that determination, that refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable, that's what won La Fière. Not superior numbers or firepower or equipment, just men who decided they wouldn't give up, who looked at impossible odds and said, "We stay." Who understood that sometimes courage is simply the decision to do your job regardless of cost. The Germans thought they were attacking a group of scattered paratroopers, defending an indefensible position. Actually, they were attacking an elite infantry unit holding the perfect defensive terrain with the perfect weapons for that terrain, led by officers who understood exactly why losing was not acceptable. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, they had lost 3 tanks, 400 infantry, and any chance of stopping the Utah Beach breakout. The trap had worked backward. The Germans thought they had the Americans trapped at La Fière. Actually, La Fière trapped German forces in a position where they couldn't win, couldn't retreat, and could only die trying. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.